At exactly 6:45 in the morning, an entire neighborhood froze in shock. The deep rumble of heavy military trucks rolled through the quiet suburban street like distant thunder. One by one, the vehicles turned the corner and stopped in front of a small, aging house at the end of the block. Within seconds, dozens of United States Marines stepped out and surrounded the home. Boots hit the pavement in perfect rhythm. The sound echoed through the morning air. Curtains slowly moved as neighbors peeked through their windows. A man watering his lawn stopped mid-step. A woman walking her dog froze and stared. Phones began coming out as people quietly started recording. Whispers spread quickly from one house to another. Did someone dangerous live there? Is this some kind of raid? Why would the Marines come here? But the small house they surrounded didn't belong to a criminal. It belonged to 17-year-old Jamal Carter, a quiet high school student who had never been in trouble a single day of his life. Inside the house, Jamal was just finishing his breakfast before school. The smell of toast filled the tiny kitchen while the morning news played softly on an old television. Jamal lived there with his mother, Angela Carter. Life had never been easy for them. Angela worked long shifts as a cleaner at a local hospital. She left early in the morning and often came home late at night, exhausted from hours of hard work. Money was always tight. Their house was small. Their furniture was old. But Angela always reminded Jamal of something important. Being kind doesn't cost anything, she would say. And Jamal truly believed that. Even though they didn't have much, Jamal had something many people with money didn't have. A heart full of kindness. Every afternoon after school, Jamal followed the same routine. He walked home with his backpack slung over one shoulder, taking the same streets he had walked for years. On the way home, he always passed the city bus station. And for months, there had been someone sitting on the same worn-out bench near the entrance. An elderly homeless woman. Her gray hair was tangled, and her coat looked like it had survived many winters. A small shopping cart sat beside her, holding the few belongings she owned. Her name was Miss Eleanor. Most people pretended she wasn't there. Commuters rushed past her without making eye contact. Some people even crossed the street to avoid walking near her. But Jamal noticed something different the first day he saw her. She looked lonely, not angry, not dangerous, just forgotten. So one afternoon, Jamal did something simple. He walked over and offered her half of the sandwich his mom had packed for lunch. At first, Miss Eleanor looked surprised. "You don't have to do that, young man," she said gently. But Jamal smiled and handed it to her anyway. "It's okay," he said. "I can share." From that day forward, it became a routine. Every afternoon, Jamal stopped at the bench. Sometimes he brought a sandwich, sometimes fruit, sometimes leftovers his mom had packed for him. And every time, Miss Eleanor smiled like it was the greatest gift in the world. They began talking more and more. She told him stories about places she had once traveled, about cities she had seen long ago, about life lessons she had learned over the years. Jamal would sit beside her for a few minutes before heading home. To him, she wasn't just a homeless woman anymore. She was a friend. But Jamal never imagined that someone had been quietly noticing his kindness. And he definitely never imagined that one simple act of sharing food would lead to a moment so shocking that an entire neighborhood would wake up to 50 Marines standing outside his house. Miss Eleanor had been living near the bus station for months. Most people in the neighborhood had grown used to seeing her there. She always sat on the same worn-out wooden bench near the corner of the station, with a small shopping cart beside her holding a few blankets and some old bags. Her gray hair was messy, and her coat looked thin from years of wear. The sleeves were slightly torn, and the fabric had faded from the sun and rain. Life on the streets had clearly not been easy, but despite everything, there was something gentle about her. Her eyes were kind. They carried the quiet wisdom of someone who had lived through many chapters of life. The first time Jamal spoke to her, she looked surprised. Most people walked past her quickly without saying a word. Some pretended not to see her at all. But Jamal had stopped. He stood there for a moment, holding the sandwich his mom had packed for his lunch. Then he held out toward her. Miss Eleanor blinked in surprise. "You don't have to give me anything, young man," she said softly, her voice calm but slightly tired. But Jamal simply smiled. "It's okay," he said. "I can share." At first, she hesitated. Then she slowly accepted the sandwich. "Thank you," she said quietly. From that moment on, a small but meaningful routine began. Every afternoon after school, Jamal stopped by the bus station before heading home. Sometimes he brought a sandwich, sometimes fruit. Other days, he shared leftovers his mom had packed for him. And occasionally, when he had earned a little extra money from his small weekend job helping at a local grocery store, he bought Miss Eleanor something warm to eat. A hot cup of soup, a cup of coffee, or a simple meal from the nearby cafe. Every time he handed her food, her face lit up with the same grateful smile. But what Miss Eleanor seemed to appreciate even more than the food was the conversation. Jamal didn't just drop something off and leave. He sat beside her for a few minutes, and slowly, she began sharing stories. She told him about traveling across the country many years ago, about the cities she had visited, the mountains she had seen, the long train rides she once took when she was younger. She spoke about people she had known long ago, friends who had come and gone, moments of laughter and adventure. Listening to her stories, Jamal realized something surprising. Miss Eleanor hadn't always lived this way. Once upon a time, she had lived a life that seemed completely different from the one she lived now. But there was one topic she always avoided: her family. Whenever Jamal politely asked if she had children or relatives somewhere, she would gently change the subject. Her smile would fade slightly, and she would start talking about something else. Jamal never pushed her. He respected her silence. Then one evening, as winter slowly began settling into the city, the air grew colder than usual. The wind moved sharply through the streets, making the bus station feel even more freezing. When Jamal arrived that afternoon, he immediately noticed something was wrong. Miss Eleanor was shivering badly. Her thin coat clearly wasn't enough to protect her from the cold. Without thinking twice, Jamal removed his hoodie. It was his favorite one, dark blue with his school logo on the front. But he didn't hesitate. He gently handed it to her. "You need this more than I do," he said. Miss Eleanor looked at the hoodie for a moment before slowly taking it. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled it around her shoulders. Then she looked at Jamal with watery eyes. For a few seconds, she didn't speak. Finally, she whispered softly, "You remind me of someone." Jamal tilted his head slightly. "Who?" he asked. But Miss Eleanor simply smiled again. "Someone very special," she said quietly. Jamal returned the smile. "Just stay warm, okay?" he said. After a few more minutes of chatting, Jamal stood up, waved goodbye, and started walking home like he always did. Neither of them realized that someone had been standing across the street the entire time, watching. And what that person saw would soon lead to something that would change Jamal's life forever. That same night, something unusual happened. The bus station was quieter than usual. The evening crowd had already passed, and only a few people waited for the last buses of the night. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and a cold breeze moved through the empty benches. Miss Eleanor sat in her usual spot, wrapped in the blue hoodie Jamal had given her earlier that day. The fabric was warm, and for the first time in many nights, she felt a little protected from the cold. She looked down at the sleeves of the hoodie and smiled softly. It reminded her that kindness still existed in the world. Just then, a black car slowly pulled up near the bus station. The engine stopped, and a tall man stepped out. He was dressed in a dark suit and polished shoes, an unusual sight in that quiet part of town. He looked around carefully, as if confirming something. Then his eyes landed on the elderly woman sitting on the bench. He walked toward her slowly. Miss Eleanor noticed him approaching, but remained calm. When a man stopped a few feet away, he spoke gently. "Ma'am, are you Eleanor Whitmore?" he asked carefully. The name seemed to hang in the cold night air. For a moment, Miss Eleanor didn't respond. Her eyes slowly lifted to meet his. It had been a very long time since someone had called her by that name. Finally, she answered quietly, "Yes, why?" The man's expression changed slightly. There was relief on his face, mixed with a bit of nervousness. His voice trembled as he continued. "My name is Daniel Harris," he said, "and I've been sent by the United States Marine Corps." The moment those words were spoken, Miss Eleanor closed her eyes. Memories rushed back instantly. Memories she had spent years trying to forget. The sound of marching boots, military ceremonies, bright uniforms, and proud salutes. It had been many years since she had heard anyone mention the Marine Corps to her, and even longer since she had spoken about her past. Because Miss Eleanor wasn't just any homeless woman sitting at a bus station. Decades earlier, she had lived a completely different life. She had once been a mother of one of the most respected officers in the United States military. Her son, General Robert Whitmore, was known across the Marine Corps for his leadership, discipline, and bravery. Soldiers respected him. Commanders trusted him. His name carried great honor within the military. But behind that success was a complicated and painful family story. Years ago, a serious disagreement had created a deep divide between Eleanor and her son. Harsh words had been spoken. Pride had taken over. And one day, Eleanor had quietly walked away from the life she once knew. She left without telling anyone where she was going. For years, no one knew what had happened to her. The Marine Corps had searched many times, especially because General Whitmore had never stopped looking for his mother. But she had disappeared completely. Until now, standing beside the bench, Daniel Harris spoke again. "We've been searching for you for weeks," he said respectfully. The general never gave up hope. Miss Eleanor slowly shook her head. "I'm fine," she said calmly. "I don't need anything." Her voice was gentle but firm. Daniel looked at her worn coat, the small shopping cart beside the bench, and the cold night air surrounding them. But he could tell she had made up her mind. Still, before he left, Miss Eleanor said something unexpected. "There's a boy," she said quietly. Daniel looked at her curiously. "A boy?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. She pointed softly toward the street where Jamal usually walked every afternoon after school. "He comes here every day," she explained. "He brings me food and sometimes warm drinks." Daniel listened silently. Miss Eleanor smiled faintly. "He doesn't do it for attention," she said. "He barely has enough for himself." Her voice softened even more. "But he shares anyway." She looked down at the hoodie wrapped around her shoulders. "He's the kindest soul I've met in years." Daniel nodded quietly, clearly moved by what he had heard. He glanced down the empty street for a moment, imagining the young boy she described. Then he gave Eleanor a respectful nod before turning back toward his car. But later that night, after returning to his office, Daniel Harris picked up his phone. He made a call to someone very important, a call that would set something extraordinary into motion. And by the next morning, Jamal Carter's quiet act of kindness would lead to something no one in the neighborhood could have ever imagined. The next morning started like any other day in Jamal Carter's small home. The sun had just begun rising, casting a soft golden light through the kitchen window. Jamal sat at the small wooden table eating toast while quickly checking the time on his phone. He didn't want to be late for school. His mother, Angela, was pouring herself a cup of coffee before heading to another long shift at the hospital. Everything felt normal, until suddenly, the quiet morning was interrupted by a deep, rumbling sound. At first it was distant, but within seconds, the noise grew louder. Heavy engines, multiple vehicles. Jamal paused mid-bite and looked toward the window. "Mom, do you hear that?" he asked. Angela frowned slightly and walked over to the front window. The moment she looked outside, her eyes widened in shock. Her hand covered her mouth. "Jamal, come here," she said quickly. Her voice sounded serious. Jamal stood up and walked over beside her. When he looked out the window, his heart skipped a beat. Outside their small house, dozens of United States Marines stood in perfect formation. Military trucks and dark vehicles lined the entire street. Their polished boots stood evenly spaced across the pavement, and their uniforms looked sharp in the morning sunlight. The entire neighborhood had noticed. Curtains were pulled aside in nearly every house. Neighbors stood on their porches whispering. Some people had already started recording with their phones. No one could understand why so many Marines had suddenly arrived in their quiet neighborhood. Jamal's heart began pounding. "Mom, what's happening?" he asked nervously. Angela shook her head slowly. I have no idea." Just then, one Marine officer stepped forward from the formation. He walked confidently up the small pathway toward Jamal's front door. His footsteps were calm but firm. Then he knocked. 3 solid knocks. The sound echoed through the house. Jamal and his mother exchanged nervous looks. Angela gestured toward the door. "Go see what they want," she whispered. Jamal took a deep breath and slowly opened the door. The sight in front of him made him freeze. Standing directly outside were rows of uniformed Marines. Their posture was straight and disciplined. The officer standing at the front looked directly at Jamal. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the officer raised his hand and gave Jamal a respectful salute. "Are you Jamal Carter?" he asked. Jamal blinked in surprise. He had never spoken to a Marine officer before. "Yes, sir," he answered nervously. The officer studied him for a moment. Then something unexpected happened. His serious expression softened into a small, warm smile. "We're here because of something you did," the officer said. Jamal looked completely confused. "I didn't do anything," he replied honestly. The officer shook his head gently. "Yes, you did. You showed kindness when nobody else did." Jamal didn't understand what he meant. Before he could ask another question, the officer stepped slightly to the side. Someone was standing behind him, an elderly woman, but she looked different from the way Jamal had always seen her. Her gray hair had been brushed neatly. She was wearing clean, warm clothes, and her posture looked stronger than before. Jamal's eyes widened immediately. "Miss Eleanor," he said in surprise. The elderly woman smiled warmly. "Yes, Jamal. You look different," he said honestly. She laughed softly. "Thanks to you." Jamal stood there in disbelief. He had never expected to see her standing here, outside his house, surrounded by Marines. Then the officer spoke again, addressing both Jamal and the curious neighbors watching from their homes. "The woman you helped every day at the bus station," he explained, "is the mother of General Robert Whitmore." The reaction was instant. Gasps spread through the crowd of neighbors. People looked at each other in shock. Some whispered the general's name in disbelief. Jamal stood frozen. He had no idea that the quiet elderly woman he had been helping was connected to someone so important. But the officer raised his hand slightly, calming the growing whispers. "But that's not why we're here today," he said clearly. The Marines behind him stood tall and silent. "We're here to recognize something far more important." He looked directly at Jamal again. "We're here to thank the young man who treated her with dignity when the rest of the world chose to ignore her." Miss Eleanor slowly stepped forward from behind the Marine officer. The morning sunlight gently reflected off her clean coat, and for the first time since Jamal had known her, she looked strong and confident. She walked toward Jamal with a warm smile on her face. When she reached him, she gently held his hands in hers. Her hands were still slightly rough from years of hardship, but her grip was full of gratitude. "For months," she began softly, her voice filled with emotion, "you brought me food when you barely had enough for yourself." The crowd watching from the street grew completely silent. "You shared your lunches, your warm drinks, and even your favorite hoodie," she continued. Her eyes began to shine with tears. "You gave me warmth when people walked past me like I didn't exist." Jamal looked down, clearly embarrassed by the attention. To him, what he had done never felt like something special. It just felt like the right thing to do. "I was just helping," he said quietly. The Marine officer standing beside them smiled proudly. "Exactly," he replied. "That's the kind of character we respect." The officer then turned slightly and gestured toward one of the Marines standing nearby. The Marine stepped forward holding a small dark folder. He carefully handed it to the officer, who then passed it to Jamal. Jamal looked at the folder nervously before opening it. Inside was an official document. At first, he didn't fully understand what he was reading. Then his eyes widened. It was a full college scholarship sponsored by the Marine Corps Foundation. The scholarship would cover his entire college education. Tuition, books, housing, everything. Jamal's hands began to shake slightly. Behind him, his mother Angela covered her mouth in shock. Tears instantly filled her eyes. She had spent years worrying about how she would ever afford to send her son to college. And now, because of his kindness, that burden had suddenly disappeared. But the Marine officer wasn't finished speaking. He stepped forward so everyone in the neighborhood could hear him clearly. "Your kindness reminded us of something important," he said. His voice carried across the quiet street. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. He glanced back at the rows of Marines standing proudly behind him. Then he looked back at Jamal. Sometimes, he continued, heroes carry backpacks, walk home from school, and share their lunch with someone who needs it. The words touched everyone listening. Neighbors stood silently on their lawns and porches. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. Then something happened that no one expected. The Marine officer turned toward his fellow soldiers and gave a small signal. Immediately, all 50 Marines stood perfectly straight in formation. The sound of their boots shifting echoed across the street. Then, at the exact same moment, every Marine raised their hand. And together, they saluted Jamal Carter, the quiet teenage boy who had simply chosen kindness. For a moment, Jamal didn't know how to react. No one had ever saluted him before. The entire neighborhood stood in stunned silence. Then slowly, someone began clapping. Another person joined. Within seconds, the whole street filled with applause. Some neighbors cheered. Others wiped tears from their eyes as they watched the powerful moment unfold. Jamal stood there speechless, holding the scholarship folder in his hands while Miss Eleanor smiled proudly beside him. All he had done was share food with someone who was hungry. He never expected anything in return. But that simple act of kindness had reached people far beyond a quiet bench at the bus station. It had reached the Marine Corps. It had reached an entire neighborhood. And most importantly, it had reminded everyone watching of something powerful. As the Marines slowly returned to their vehicles and the trucks began driving away, the message of that morning stayed behind. Because sometimes the smallest acts create the biggest impact. And that day, everyone on that street learned something they would never forget. One small act of kindness can echo louder than 1,000 heroic speeches. And sometimes, the world notices.